The sun hung high over the quiet suburban street, casting a golden glow across the parked cars. It looked like any ordinary afternoon, peaceful, calm, predictable. But inside one black luxury car parked at the curb, something unusual was unfolding. Sharon Osbourne leaned forward slightly, her brow furrowed, eyes scanning the man sitting behind the wheel. Something about him didn't sit right. "Sharon, is this your driver?" she asked, her voice just above a whisper, carrying curiosity and disbelief in equal measure. The words barely left her lips before the atmosphere shifted. The quiet hum of the car engine seemed louder, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For a moment, time froze. You could almost hear the ticking of a clock in the background, a suspenseful drumbeat leading to a revelation nobody was expecting. People walking by glanced over, sensing the tension in the air but not knowing why. The man behind the wheel stiffened slightly, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He looked like an ordinary driver at first glance, but there was something different, something familiar that Sharon couldn't quite place. And then there was Ozzy, always unpredictable, always larger than life, sitting calmly in the passenger seat. A small smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth, but his eyes were sharp, alert, taking in every detail. You could tell he knew exactly what was about to happen, yet he made no move to intervene. Instead, he leaned back, letting the tension build, letting the moment simmer. It was a simple question, just 6 words, yet it carried weight. In that instant, the ordinary afternoon felt charged with possibility. Who was this man, really? What connection did he have to Sharon or to Ozzy? Why did the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end as the question hung in the air? Nobody had the answer yet, not the driver, not Sharon, and certainly not the strangers passing by. But one thing was clear: whatever happened next would leave everyone stunned. One small question, uttered casually, was about to trigger a chain reaction of surprise, laughter, and disbelief that nobody in that car or on that street would ever forget. And that's the moment the story begins. The moment where curiosity meets chaos, where fame meets the unexpected, and where Ozzy Osbourne does something that no one, absolutely no one, saw coming. The street was quiet, almost eerily so, like the calm before a storm. A gentle breeze rustled through the leaves, carrying with it the faint hum of distant traffic. Yet inside the sleek black car parked near the curb, a tension simmered beneath the surface, one that was invisible to passers-by, but impossible to ignore once you were there. Sharon Osbourne shifted slightly in her seat, the sunlight catching the golden highlights of her hair. She had always been perceptive, a keen eye for details most people overlooked, and today was no different. Her eyes were locked on the man sitting behind the wheel, a figure who seemed ordinary enough, dressed in a standard driver's uniform, hands poised neatly on the steering wheel. But something about him didn't feel right. He was too still, too calculated, and yet oddly familiar. Ozzy Osbourne, ever the enigma, sat calmly beside her. The Prince of Darkness was not one to panic, not even in unexpected situations, but there was a spark in his eyes, a mixture of amusement and curiosity. He watched Sharon with a knowing smile, as if he anticipated the question that was about to escape her lips. The contrast between his cool composure and Sharon's tense focus made the air feel electric, charged with unspoken possibilities. "Sharon, is this your driver?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper this time. The words hung in the car, bouncing off the leather seats and tinted windows, as if the car itself were holding its breath. Outside, a few pedestrians passed by, unaware that they were mere spectators to an unfolding moment of suspense. The driver's head turned slightly, eyes flicking toward Sharon, registering her question, though his expression remained inscrutable. It was a simple scene, yet layered with intrigue. Sharon and Ozzy, a couple known for their larger-than-life personalities, were caught in an ordinary situation, a man behind the wheel of a car. Yet with one glance, Sharon sensed that this was no ordinary driver, and Ozzy, with his calm yet mischievous demeanor, seemed to know far more than he was letting on. Every detail mattered: the glint of sunlight on the car's chrome, the faint scent of leather and perfume in the air, the subtle tension in Sharon's hands as she rested them on her lap. It was a moment suspended between curiosity and anticipation, where even the mundane, a parked car, a driver, a question, felt monumental. In that quiet suburban street, the stage was set. What seemed like an ordinary afternoon was about to erupt into a moment of shock, laughter, and disbelief. And at the center of it all, Ozzy Osbourne was ready to do something that nobody, not even Sharon, could have predicted. The car sat still, a bubble of anticipation in the quiet suburban street. Outside, life moved in slow motion, birds flitted from branch to branch, distant cars passed without incident, and a dog barked somewhere down the road. But inside the sleek black vehicle, time seemed to bend, stretching each second into a drawn-out moment of curiosity and quiet tension. Sharon's eyes were locked on the driver. She studied every detail, the way he gripped the steering wheel, the subtle twitch of his fingers, the faint crease of concentration between his brows. Something about him tugged at her memory, a familiarity she couldn't place. It was almost as if she knew him, but couldn't quite reach the name, the face, the story behind those eyes. Ozzy, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, arms crossed casually, but his expression told a different story. There was a flicker of mischief in his eyes, a tiny smirk that hinted he was silently orchestrating the moment. He didn't speak, didn't intervene, but his presence alone amplified the tension. Everyone knew Ozzy had a flair for the dramatic, for turning the mundane into something unforgettable. And right now, the air inside the car was thick with anticipation, like the pause before the first note of a legendary guitar solo. Sharon's heartbeat quickened. She could feel the warmth of the sun through the tinted windows, but it did nothing to calm the sudden chill that ran down her spine. The driver's gaze shifted toward her again, more deliberate this time, and she caught a glimmer of something unexpected: recognition, hesitation. The question lingered in her mind: who is this man? The silence was deafening. Every small sound seemed amplified: the faint hum of the engine, the whisper of the wind against the car, even the distant footsteps of a passerby outside. The ordinary world continued, oblivious to the tension building inside this one small vehicle. Sharon swallowed hard, uncertainty twisting in her chest. She had asked the question, but now that it hung in the air, she wondered if she was ready for the answer. Then, a small movement, just a flicker, shattered the fragile quiet. The driver adjusted his grip on the wheel, and for a split second his eyes met Ozzy's. And in that brief glance, Sharon sensed it. Something was about to happen that would change everything. The air seemed to tighten around them, charged with expectation, with suspense, with the promise of an unexpected revelation. The moment stretched. The question was simple, yet it carried weight far beyond its words. Is this your driver? In that quiet bubble, with the suburban street as a backdrop, and the sun casting long shadows across the dashboard, the ordinary collided with the extraordinary. Every muscle in Sharon's body tensed, every nerve on edge, and somewhere in that stillness, the stage was perfectly set for the moment that would leave everyone stunned. Because with Ozzy Osbourne, ordinary situations rarely remain ordinary for long. And whatever happened next, Sharon knew, would not just surprise her, it would astonish everyone who had the privilege of witnessing it. The air inside the car had grown almost electric, a quiet storm of tension and anticipation. Sharon's eyes were fixed on the man behind the wheel, the driver who had seemed ordinary just minutes ago, but now carried an invisible weight. Every detail about him seemed magnified: the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his shoulders were rigid, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was as if the universe had pressed pause on the suburban street outside, funneling every second, every heartbeat into this one critical moment. Sharon's lips parted slightly. The words had been forming in her mind since the first glances at the driver, but now, as the seconds dragged on, the question took on a life of its own. "Is this your driver?" she asked, her voice quieter than a whisper, yet resonant enough to pierce the stillness like a single drop of water in a silent cavern. The words hung in the air, stretching into eternity. For a moment it seemed as if the car itself was holding its breath. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked. A car horn blared somewhere down the street, and the world tried to carry on, but inside, time slowed. Sharon felt every microsecond as if it were an eternity, a suspended heartbeat waiting for what would come next. The driver's eyes widened slightly. His gaze flicked first to Sharon, then to Ozzy, as though trying to read the room, gauge the stakes, and figure out exactly how to respond. There was a split second of hesitation, a moment where nothing happened, and yet everything shifted. Sharon could feel her pulse quicken. Her stomach twisted with anticipation. What happens now? She wondered. What is he going to say? Ozzy, as always, remained calm, deceptively so. He leaned back, hands resting on his knees, eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and mischief. There was no panic, no urgency, only a quiet, knowing presence that made the moment even more intense. It was the look of a man who had seen countless surprises in his life, yet always knew how to control the timing, how to pull the strings so that the impact was maximum. The silence stretched. The driver swallowed, a subtle movement almost lost in the tension of the moment. He shifted his weight, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow down to three figures in a parked car. Sharon, Ozzy, and him. Every unspoken thought, every hidden reaction seemed amplified. This was more than just a question. It was a challenge, a spark, a pivotal point where the ordinary collided with the extraordinary. Sharon's heart raced. She could see the faintest smile tugging at the driver's lips, but was it recognition, amusement, or uncertainty? The question she had asked, simple yet loaded, had set the stage for something bigger, something unforgettable. She didn't yet know what Ozzy would do, but she knew that the calm, composed man beside her had a plan, a move that would leave not just her, but everyone watching, completely stunned. And then, in that pregnant pause, Sharon realized sometimes a simple question isn't just a question, it's a doorway. A doorway to revelation, to surprise, to the kind of moment people will remember for years. And behind that doorway, Ozzy was already preparing his next move, one that would change the ordinary afternoon into a story that no one could forget. Ozzy didn't answer right away. That alone was unsettling. Most people, when cornered by an awkward question, rush to fill the silence, nervous laughter, a quick explanation, anything to break the tension. Ozzy did the opposite. He let the quiet stretch. He let the moment breathe. And in that pause, the weight of the question grew heavier with every second. Then, slowly, Ozzy leaned forward. The movement was subtle but deliberate. The leather seat creaked softly as he shifted his weight. Sharon felt it instantly, the change in energy, the sense that something had just been set in motion. Ozzy's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, locking onto the driver's reflection. Not confrontational, not angry, just focused. "Well," Ozzy said at last, his voice calm, almost amused. "That depends." The driver froze. Sharon turned toward Ozzy, confused. "Depends on what?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Ozzy didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he reached for the door handle. Click. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Before Sharon could say another word, Ozzy pushed the door open and stepped out of the car. That was the moment everything changed. Pedestrians slowed. A couple across the street stopped walking altogether. You could feel it, that instinctive sense that something unusual was happening. Ozzy Osbourne didn't storm out. He didn't shout. He simply stood there for a second, breathing in the afternoon air, as calm as if this were all part of a rehearsed performance. Then he walked around to the front of the car. The driver watched him approach through the windshield, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Ozzy stopped just inches from the hood, leaned down slightly, and looked straight at him. Up close, personal. "So," Ozzy said softly, just loud enough to be heard, "how long were you planning on pretending?" Sharon's heart skipped. The driver blinked. His mouth opened, then closed again. Whatever composure he'd been holding on to cracked just enough to reveal fear, surprise, and something else beneath it. "Recognition, I don't know what you mean," the driver stammered. Ozzy smiled. Not a mocking smile. Not an angry one. It was the kind of smile that said, "I already know the truth." "Oh, come on," Ozzy said, straightening up. "You didn't think I wouldn't recognize you?" "Not after all these years." Sharon's breath caught in her throat. Recognize him, she thought. From where? The driver exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the moment had finally become too much to carry. Slowly he reached up and removed his sunglasses. Then his cap. And just like that, the illusion fell apart. Gasps rippled from the small crowd that had begun to gather nearby. Sharon's eyes widened as the man in the driver's seat was suddenly no longer a stranger. The posture, the face, the expression, it all clicked into place at once. This wasn't just a driver. This was someone from Ozzy's past, someone who had once stood beside him long before the fame, the lights, the chaos. Ozzy leaned in again, his voice softer now. "You saved me once," he said quietly. "You think I'd forget that?" Silence. Then the driver's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't think you'd remember," he whispered. Ozzy stepped back, nodded once, and turned toward Sharon. "This," he said, gesturing toward the driver, "isn't my drawers. This is family." And in that instant, the tension shattered. not into chaos, but into stunned disbelief. What began as a simple question had turned into a reunion no one saw coming. And Ozzy Osbourne, as always, had transformed an ordinary moment into something unforgettable. For a long moment no one spoke. The words, "This is family," lingered in the air like an echo that refused to fade. Sharon remained frozen in her seat, trying to process what she had just heard. Family. The man who had been sitting silently behind the wheel, pretending to be just another hired driver, was suddenly something far more important, someone woven into Ozzy's past in a way she had never imagined. Ozzy turned fully toward the driver now, his expression shifting from playful to sincere. The showmanship was gone. What remained was raw honesty. This was before the fame, Ozzy said quietly, almost to himself. Before the tours, before the madness. The driver nodded slowly, eyes glistening. His voice trembled when he finally spoke. "We were kids," he said. "Just trying to survive." The street around them seemed to dissolve as the story unfolded. Years ago, long before Ozzy Osbourne became a global icon, there had been nights when music didn't pay the bills, when hunger was real, and when the future felt impossibly small. The driver had been there during those nights. He'd shared cramped rooms, broken equipment, missed meals. When Ozzy had nothing, this man had stood beside him, not for money, not for fame, but out of loyalty. Sharon felt a tightness in her chest. Ozzy continued, "There was a night I could have lost everything," he said. "One wrong decision, one bad moment." He glanced at the driver. "You pulled me out, literally." The driver looked down, ashamed and humbled at the same time. "I just did what anyone should do," he said. "You were my friend." Sharon finally stepped out of the car, standing beside Ozzy now. She looked at the man again, not as a stranger, not as an employee, but as someone who had helped shape the man she loved. Suddenly, the familiar feeling she'd sensed earlier made sense. It wasn't recognition, it was gravity, the weight of history. "But why now?" Sharon asked gently. "Why pretend?" The driver hesitated. Then, quietly, "I didn't want anything from you," he said to Ozzy. "Not money, not attention. I just wanted to see you again, to know you were okay." Ozzy swallowed hard. That was the twist no one expected. This wasn't a setup. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't someone chasing fame. It was a man who had faded into the background of history, watching from afar, choosing anonymity over recognition. Someone who believed his role in Ozzy's life had ended long ago. "I figured." The man continued, "You wouldn't even remember me." Ozzy shook his head instantly. "You don't forget the people who saved you when you were nothing," he said firmly. "Those faces don't disappear." The small crowd around them had gone silent. Phones were lowered. No one wanted to interrupt what felt like a sacred moment, a reunion rooted in survival, loyalty, and time. Ozzy placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "You didn't drive me today," he said. "You walked me here years ago. I just took a while to catch up." The driver let out a shaky laugh, wiping his eyes. "I guess I didn't plan this very well." Ozzy smiled softly. "You never did." Laughter rippled gently through the tension, breaking it just enough to let the emotion breathe. Sharon watched the two men, one a global legend, the other invisible to the world, and understood something profound. Fame hadn't created Ozzy Osbourne. People like this had, and that was the real revelation. Not that the driver was someone from Ozzy's past, but that even after decades of chaos, success, and superstardom, Ozzy still measured loyalty the same way he always had, not by titles, not by status, but by who stood beside you when no one else would. And suddenly, the stunned silence around them made sense. This wasn't just a twist. It was a reminder. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, dense with emotion, with understanding, with the kind of stillness that only comes after something real has been revealed. No one rushed to speak. No one felt the need to move. The moment demanded respect, and instinctively everyone gave it. Sharon was the first to break it. She stepped closer to the man who had once been invisible to her, her expression softened by a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not as Ozzy Osbourne's wife, not as a public figure, just as a human being who had suddenly realized how close she'd come to never knowing a crucial piece of the man she loved." The driver, no, the friend, nodded, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being thanked, not for this, not after all these years. Ozzy watched Sharon with a faint smile, one filled with pride and relief. For the first time since the question had been asked, the tension in his shoulders melted away. The weight he'd carried of memory, of gratitude left unspoken, finally seemed lighter. Around them the small crowd had grown. A few people stood frozen, unsure whether they were allowed to witness something this personal. Some had tears in their eyes. Others simply stared, mouths slightly open, trying to reconcile what they had just seen with the image of Ozzy Osbourne they thought they knew. One man shook his head slowly. "That's Ozzy," he murmured to no one in particular. "That's not what I expected." A woman nearby wiped her eyes. "That's better," she whispered. The driver's hands trembled as he finally stepped out of the car. Without the uniform, without the disguise of role or responsibility, he looked smaller somehow, more human, vulnerable. He stood awkwardly, unsure where he belonged in this moment, unsure if he'd crossed a line by reappearing at all. Ozzy noticed immediately. "Hey," he said gently, reaching out. "You're not in trouble." That simple sentence did something powerful. The man let out a breath he'd clearly been holding for years. His posture loosened, his eyes lifted. For the first time since stepping out of the car, he smiled. Not nervously, not defensively, but freely. Sharon glanced between them, then laughed softly, shaking her head in disbelief. "I thought I was being paranoid," she said. "I just had this feeling." "You were right," Ozzy replied.
"You always are."
That earned a ripple of laughter, quiet, respectful, but real. The heaviness cracked just enough to let warmth seep in. Phones came out now, slowly, almost apologetically. Not to capture a scandal, not to chase a viral moment, but to hold on to something people knew they'd never see again. A reunion that had nothing to do with fame, and everything to do with survival. Someone whispered, "This is why he's still here." Another replied, "This is why people love him." Ozzy turned toward the small crowd, raising a hand gently, not to command attention, but to acknowledge them. "Life's strange," he said simply. "You walk past people every day not knowing what they once did for you, or what you once meant to them." No one interrupted, no one needed more. The driver wiped his face again, embarrassed. "Didn't mean to make a scene," he said quietly. Ozzy scoffed lightly. "Mate, my whole career is a scene." That did it. Laughter broke through fully this time, not forced, not awkward, but honest. The kind that releases pressure, the kind that heals. Sharon watched Ozzy in that moment and saw something deeper than the icon, deeper than the legend. She saw the same man he'd been before the world claimed him, loyal, emotional, fiercely protective of the people who mattered. And the people watching felt it too. This wasn't a celebrity story anymore. It was a human one, a reminder that behind every legend is a past full of unseen faces, and that sometimes the most powerful reactions aren't applause or shock, but quiet understanding. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the street returned to its familiar rhythm, something lingered in the air, something heavier than surprise, deeper than admiration. It was understanding. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand attention, but quietly reshapes the way you see the world. Ozzy and Sharon stood side by side, watching the man who had once been a lifeline now blend back into the ordinary flow of life. No spotlight followed him. No applause echoed behind him. And yet, his presence had shifted everything. That was the lesson. Not every hero wears a title. Not every act of loyalty comes with recognition. And not every story worth telling is meant to be loud. Ozzy broke the silence softly. "Funny thing about life," he said, almost to himself. "The people who help you climb, they're usually the ones who don't stick around at the top." Sharon nodded. She understood now. Success has a way of erasing footprints. As time passes, names fade, faces blur, and moments that once felt like survival turn into distant memories, unless something brings them back into focus. What made this moment powerful wasn't fame or coincidence. It was memory. It was gratitude that survived decades of noise. Ozzy hadn't just recognized a face, he'd honored a debt that time couldn't erase, and that's what struck everyone who witnessed it. In a world obsessed with credit, visibility, and validation, this moment quietly pushed back. It reminded everyone watching that the most important people in your life might never ask for anything in return. They don't chase acknowledgement. They don't announce their sacrifices. They simply show up when it matters and then disappear when it doesn't. The driver had never come back for fame. He hadn't come back for money. He came back to see, not to take. And in doing so, he taught everyone a lesson that felt almost forgotten. True loyalty doesn't need an audience. Sharon looked at Ozzy then, really looked at him. Not the performer, not the legend, but the man who remembered who he was before the world decided who he should be. And she realized something powerful: success doesn't change people. It reveals them. The street returned to normal. Cars passed. Conversations resumed. But those who had witnessed the moment carried it with them, like a quiet weight in their chest. Some thought of friends they'd lost touch with. Others thought of people who had helped them during their darkest moments, and wondered if they'd ever said thank you. That's the real takeaway. Check your past. Remember who stood by you when you had nothing to offer. Because those are the connections that matter, not the loud ones, not the convenient ones, but the silent ones that shape who you become. Ozzy turned toward Sharon with a small smile. Life's strange, he said again. You never know when yesterday is going to show up and remind you who you really are. She squeezed his hand, and maybe that's why this moment resonated so deeply, not because it was dramatic or unexpected, but because it was honest. It reminded everyone watching that no matter how far you go, no matter how high you climb, the measure of who you are isn't found at the peak. It's found in who you remember on the way up. The car door closed softly, not with a slam, not with drama, just a quiet click, like a full stop at the end of a sentence that had taken decades to finish. Ozzy took one last look down the street where the man had disappeared, then turned back toward Sharon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some stories don't ask for commentary, they ask for reflection. As the car pulled away, life returned to normal for everyone else. Traffic moved, phones buzzed. Conversations picked back up. But for those who had witnessed it, something stayed behind: a question, a memory, a name from the past that suddenly felt important again. Because this wasn't just a story about Ozzy Osbourne. It was a story about us, about the people who helped when there was nothing to gain, about the faces we haven't thought of in years, but should, about the moments that didn't feel legendary at the time, yet quietly shaped everything that came after. Fame didn't make this moment powerful. Humanity did. Ozzy didn't shout. He didn't perform. He didn't turn it into a spectacle. He did something far rarer, he remembered. And in remembering, he reminded everyone watching of a truth we often forget in a world that moves too fast. The past doesn't disappear, it waits. It waits in faces you don't expect, in places you don't look anymore, in people who never ask to be remembered, but deserve to be. So here's the question this moment leaves behind. Who helped you when no one was watching? And have you ever gone back to say thank you? Because one day you might cross paths again on an ordinary street in an ordinary moment and realize that the most important people in your life were never meant to be strangers. They were meant to be remembered, and sometimes all it takes is one simple question to bring everything back.